We are back, still on the code of good practice on the prevention and elimination of violence and harassment in the workplace. For the purposes of this training, I will be calling it code. So the code has procedural requirements that it places on the employer. So employers are under an obligation to take proactive remedial steps to prevent all forms of harassment in the workplace. Employers should also have zero tolerance in the workplace towards harassment and violence. So the code also provides guidelines on how the employer can ensure that no harassment takes place in the workplace, that no harassment and no violence takes place in the workplace. So the following are the guidelines for the employer. The employer and employees are obligated to refrain from harassment. Employers and employees have a role to play towards creating and maintaining a safe working environment. So the code places a responsibility on both the employer and the employee on the elimination and prevention of harassment and violence in the workplace. So in other words, all employees within a business are required to ensure that no harassment and no violence takes place. So this responsibility lies on employees, whether they are on a managerial level or whether they are on the unskilled level. So the CEO down to the general worker, they all have a responsibility to ensure that no harassment and no violence takes place in the workplace. So employers and employees should ensure that no one is subjected to harassment, even people that are coming on the premises of the employer, be it clients, be it suppliers. Everyone within the business must make sure that everyone that has dealings with the business, everyone that works in the business, they're treated with dignity and respect. Policies and procedures need to be implemented to provide a clear statement concerning harassment in the workplace. Awareness training such as this one needs to be implemented in the workplace, and everyone in the organization needs to undergo such a training. So from the CEO to the general worker to the supervisor, everyone is required to undergo such a training to learn about prevention and elimination of harassment and violence in the workplace. Employers are required to take the necessary steps when it comes to dealing with harassment cases. So harassment cases should not be swept under the carpet, but they should be dealt with as provided for by the guidelines in the code. Okay, when it comes to harassment policies, we heard that it's included in the guidelines to assist employers in preventing and eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace. So employers are required to adopt a harassment policy guided by the provisions of the code. As I said, that I would be referring to this as the code, like the code on the elimination, prevention of violence and harassment in the workplace. So contents of the policies should be communicated clearly to all employees. So how I usually ensure this is that I would do this during induction. So during induction, I communicate all the policies and procedures of the business and then make sure that the employees, they understand and they sign it. And if they have any other questions relevant to the policy and procedure, they ask during that induction period. And then I also make notes on it on our induction notes that I will sign as HR who conducted the induction, and the employee will sign as well. And then policies should state clearly that harassment is prohibited and will not be tolerated. Policies should also make provisions on how grievances concerning harassment will be handled. Policies should stress that harassment issues will be handled confidentially, and also advise the availability of counseling, treatment, care, and support of victims of harassment. So the issue of confidentiality is important so that victims can have the courage of coming forward without fear that everyone will know that they were subjected to harassment, like preserving their dignity, in other words. And then harassment procedures. Harassment must immediately be brought to the attention of the employer. So this can be included in the harassment policy and procedure so that the steps that need to be followed to deal with the harassment case are clearly included. in the policy and procedure on the prevention of harassment. Employer should take into consideration that sometimes harassed employees are afraid and might not report immediately. So it shouldn't be a case that if somebody reports after a few weeks, the employer or the HR person asks, but why did you keep quiet for so long? We are no longer going to entertain your case. No, such cases should be handled, and this should be taken into consideration that maybe the employee was afraid to come forward, and then harassment may be brought to the attention of the employer by the complainant or any other person that might become aware of the harassment. So an example, I keep referring to that intimidating boardroom scenario that I once experienced. So let's say maybe you were in that boardroom and then you can see that Anne is being belittled, harassed, ridiculed, and whatever not. So as the bystander or the observer, you can actually do something about it. As I mentioned, that is the responsibility of every employee in the organization to make sure that harassment and violence do not take place, to ensure that the working place is harmonious, safe, and peaceful. So by taking action, should be wise about it. You should use your discretion on how you're going to do it without obviously putting yourself, I'm not sure what the word will be, but without putting yourself in an unnecessarily difficult position. Maybe handle the situation with care and with wisdom and with guidance as well from HR, provided HR is not the one that is actually responsible for the harassment. So these are the obligations of the employer. When harassment has been brought to the attention of the employer needs to take the relevant steps to eliminate the incident in question. Failure to take steps will render the employer vicariously liable. So if Jabulani, who's a supervisor, is harassing Leti and the employer does not do anything about it, the employer will be vicariously liable for the harassment incident. So the steps that the employer can take include, but are not limited to, advise the complainant of the procedures available. For example, you can advise Leti that Leti, there's grievance procedures available that you can take to lodge a grievance against Jabulani. And then there is counseling. Let's say maybe the employer has an EAP program in place. EAP means Employee Assistance Program, and then follow the steps as provided for by the code. So just to summarize or just to simplify it, the obligations of the employer are to make sure that there's a safe working environment. And in order to do this, there must be the relevant procedures and policies, and the training must be done on all employees. So all of these can be covered in induction, and from the onset of the employment relationship, the employee knows what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So on to our next activity. This is a highly interactive course. So we're going to be reading the handout. I will also include it in this online training. The activity is called Changing the Narrative, Addressing Justified Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. So that is just for you, not just for you actually, it's to get us thinking. So please read this and then discuss or write on the handouts provided, like what are your takeaways from the case, without getting too technical, because I understand that not everyone who's attending this course is an employment law expert. So we shall be back after that activity to continue with our section 9 of the awareness training on the code of good practice on the elimination and prevention of harassment and violence in the workplace.